Hello and welcome back to the GCP-Mindset channel. Today we'll talk about centralized statistical monitoring and we'll give some real-world insights.
Our first question is, what kinds of data quality issues are most often detected early through central statistical monitoring? And what analytical tools are typically used?
So first of all, it's important to understand that with everything statistics, it's that more data means you have better trends and you have more reliability of the outcome that you create. And the same is true with statistical monitoring of trial data as part of centralized statistical monitoring. So that being said, it is still possible in the early phases of a trial to look at the output and already identify certain trends within the data. I would personally say that I've observed that more to be true for trends between countries or trends between individual trial sites and other trial sites than on an individual patient's data. Here you need a little bit more robust information to really start seeing differences, which you can later on employing statistical methods. So when we focus on early trends, on differences between trial sites and or different countries, one example that I can give is we have run a trial in which we visualized the adverse event rate per site, and we really saw a very clear difference between one site, one country, and all other participating sites and countries. In this case, we saw that over the course of a 2-week treatment period, which a patient stayed in a hospital, in a German side, we had round about 7.5 adverse events per patient reported, and that was compared to just under 1 adverse event reported for all other trial sites combined. It gives a clear indication that either this trial site does not really understand the treatment mechanism, there are some errors that are occurring which are endangering the safety of the patient, or that the way that adverse events are reported is different. In this specific example, it was an infectious disease study, and everything related to the disease that the patient must have to fulfill the eligibility criteria was not supposed to be reported as adverse event. And this was done by everyone globally, which resulted in just under 1 adverse event per patient during the treatment period. And it was not done in this one site in Germany who reported everything that was considered an adverse event, even all of those that were related to the patients and their underlying disease, which is the reason why they were hospitalized in the first place and eligible for the study. So it would have been difficult, well, it would have been possible, but maybe a little bit identified a little bit later from the CRA or from the study team that such a high reporting is done when only looking at the data of this one German site, but seeing it compared to all the other accruing data made it really easy to see. And it was as simple as seeing a line shoot up like that in terms of the number of adverse events reported per patient if you plot it over the treatment period, and then you basically having a relatively stable flat graph for all other sites. So this really helps in understanding the data, visualizing it, and making it compact. And you don't really need very sophisticated statistics behind it. The statistics don't come in the visualization, it comes in understanding the structure of the data and choosing the right visualization, certainly. But then afterwards it comes in deciding when to flag certain data as statistically relevant or not. Here you can employ probability statistics to make that happen and make the review easier for the rest of the team so that you can flag values as red, as yellow, or as green to really give a visual impression of where to focus on. And that's what we are employing, so the tools are not so complicated. Automating them and putting them in action and allowing a visualization is what's a little bit more complex and what takes time, and these are elements that need to be validated to make sure that we have a robust outcome. And then it makes it easy for the teams to observe trends from the get-go, see which direction they go. And then if you see anything, you should still talk with your statistician if it's early in the trial, because these might just be coincidental. They might not refer to a full long-term trend that you could observe because there's limited data.
Can you share an example where centralized statistical monitoring significantly reduced the number of on-site monitoring visits without compromising data quality?
We run a lot of medical device trials. Why do I say that related to this topic? Because we also run a lot of post-market medical device trials. And if you compare the risk of a trial, I would always use post-market medical device trials and phase 1s, sometimes also phase 3s, as the polar opposite in terms of risk innate in a study. In a phase 1 trial, you don't yet know what the effect of the medicinal product on the human will be, what's the safety profile. You have tons of data, and everything could be an indicator of some systemic effect on the patients that endangers their lives. So you need to be really sure, and you need to really dig deep into the data. On the other side, you have a post-market product. It's basically something that your patients can get on the market whether they are in the trial or not. It's a medical device, so you only have a physical effect, so the risk is low. And so when we look at centralized statistical monitoring and we have trials that are big enough and where we can really see a lot of trends and we have a lot of information that we can compare, then the effect on monitoring is primarily driven by how low is the risk profile in the study and how much can you fully rely on centralized statistical monitoring itself. We have run trials in which we did no on-site monitoring. We have run trials in which we did limited on-site monitoring, and we have run trials in which we did a lot of on-site monitoring, all with the same degree of utilization of centralized statistical monitoring. So it comes down to the risk-based monitoring approach that you choose, and that really depends on the overall risk associated with conducting your clinical trial or clinical investigation. I would say in good, decent trials that are not on the real higher end of overall trial risk, you can already reduce your monitoring by a factor of 2 or 3 in most of the cases. And that's what we see in our studies. We can really push the envelope in terms of how much data, how many CRF pages can a CRA monitor during an on-site visit by leveraging centralized statistical monitoring coupled with remote review of outliers. That way, the CRA goes to the side with a very clear list of points to identify, a small list of points to source data verify, and then really to guide the site through data entry, open queries, any issues that we have. And that is a really effective way of leveraging statistical tools to clean data already, reducing risk for your study, and the lower the overall study risk, the more the effect you will benefit from.
How does a monitoring team practically respond to a risk signal identified in a centralized statistical monitoring dashboard? And what escalation processes work best?
Within GCP service, what we do is that we have visual overviews of all of our trial risks identified by centralized statistical monitoring. Those are trends between sites, or for individual patients, individual data, which are considered outliers and should be further cross-checked. Those overviews are first and foremost checked by remote clinical data monitors, RCDMs, from our team, which basically do a remote review of the information and assess whether underneath that statistical outlier could be an implausible data point that should be queried with the trial site. Might still be accurate, but it's something to put a focus on. So based on that, there could be a lot of issues identified or potential issues identified where remote monitor is uncertain whether or not we should raise a query, because you don't want to overburden trial sites by having spurious correlations or outliers identified as part of your statistical monitoring process. So in those cases, they revert back, they escalate it to the statistician to reconfirm whether there seems to be a trend, a tendency, or whether the structure of the data itself lends itself to seeing this divergence or a trend or anything that is really abnormal. From there, the escalation goes either directly to the trial site with a query or to the responsible monitor, who then picks up the phone, can have a conversation, or simply considers the information provided from the central team, including the statistical outcomes, during the next on-site monitoring visit. Any trends that are indicative of a serious breach, so that means, real significant data integrity issues or issues that might directly impact patient safety in the trial, those should really be very strongly assessed and immediately escalate it to the wider team directly through the project manager to ensure that everyone that should know about it is aware and can initiate the required corrective and preventive actions. So most of the time, you will find that there's a statistical signal and a remote monitor can query the sites and you can find a resolution of the data being confirmed or changed. Maybe it's a typo, for example, that leads to an outlier. And then there are these rare cases in which either a CRA or even rarer, the project manager for an entire kappa escalation are involved to resolve this issue that is identified through CSM.
What measurable benefits have been observed when centralized statistical monitoring is integrated into risk-based monitoring strategies in terms of time and budget efficiency?
So our risk-based strategy and implementation of CSM do correlate, but more often than not, we use CSM irrespective of the risk profile for really gaining efficiency and gaining insights that are otherwise hard to get from the data, especially trend analyses across sites or across countries. Nevertheless, there can be real benefits of employing risk-based approaches combined with centralized statistical monitoring to reduce on-site monitoring to near zero. Oftentimes, we will still have a desire to go to trial sites early to check elements like informed consents and to go late to reconfirm all safety events that occurred, but sometimes they are none, and then you can skip that part. And this really allows to drastically reduce the overall costs of the monitoring part of the trial. It is not uncommon for the operational budget, that is excluding all of the pass-through costs like costs from study sites, costs from electronic systems, and so on, pass-through costs from the perspective of a contract research organization such as us, to where the monitoring budget proportion of that operational budget amounts to 30-35% of the total budget for running the trial from an operational perspective of a CRO, especially in complex early phase 1 trials where a lot of on-site monitoring is required and necessary to overview a lot of safety data very closely. So when we look at CSM-enabled trials that use a high percentage of risk-based monitoring, reducing on-site monitoring, this quickly reduces the overall trial budget by sometimes 25% and pushes the proportion that monitoring constitutes of the overall trial into the low 10%. So like 12, 13%, 14%, which is the budget allocated to site engagement, early startup for the trial, collecting all the documents for regulatory submissions, and so on. So with really limited interactions with trial sites, enabled by risk-based approaches that focus on central and statistically driven review of data, you can really decrease that percentage within your trial, saving you a lot of money and still not reducing the level of quality you have in your data and still not risking data integrity.
Thanks for watching and see you next time on the GCP Mindset channel.